Hey guys, so today you and I are going to talk about coaching. So let's get into it. So the question in question was, Frederick, what are some examples of coaching a software engineer that you have done, and perhaps a software team? Well, so usually when I do coaching at the personal level, it's a little bit difficult for me to give you concrete things because it's down to that individual person, like what are their strengths, what are their weaknesses, and usually I try to find a match between what the team needs or the company needs or some initiative that we have and where we can like leverage their strengths or their passions, which is a very good thing. The way that I usually figure out what people are inclined towards is like I try to work in the I work in the teams when I have done any sort of coaching, because without knowing the person it's hard to coach them. And then after a little while of working, you sort of get a feel for, okay, what are they good at, what are they not so good at, etc., etc. And then you make a recommendation on an initiative that they can take on that's going to grow them, or like suggest to them some type of coursework or something like that. It's very much depends on the person, but the foundation of it is figure out what this individual has, like do an inventory of their strengths and their weaknesses, and figure out what's lacking from the profile or what they could look at that takes them to the next level, if that makes sense. And then you have an honest conversation with them. When it comes to coaching teams, it's a little bit bigger than that. Usually when I'm dealing with a team coaching situation, it's really down to looking at the whole delivery process, and in a sense it's you can almost think about it as a little bit as trying to make a factory more effective or so forth, because the process of delivering software has a flow to it, if that makes sense. And there are a lot of established patterns that you can follow, that like the quote unquote the basics of which is basically going to be the same thing in every single company. It's the way that most of our industry is doing work. You have a CI or CD pipeline or something like that. You have automated tests. You have code reviews. You have a Kanban board or some way of tracking, like an issue tracker of some sort, and you have some type of forum where the developers can talk to each other, etc., etc. Like these basics, if they are not in place, these are the things that I focus on first and foremost, because they are very important and very necessary to do. Like it's like the cornerstones of the whole thing. And my argument is usually that if you have an idea of doing something in a different way, that's not a problem, as long as that is going to output something more valuable than the time it takes for people to learn your special way of doing things. And it's very rare that I've found that someone has come up with like a more effective way of doing things than these basic practices. And I usually measure that. It's the same thing I've had a lot of like arguments with some Scrum masters where I've explained to them that you're trying to apply Scrum to a team that has no roadmap, and everything they do is ad hoc. What's the purpose of that? Not a single sprint has provided any value, so you're adding all this overhead on top of the process, and that's like sacrilege to a Scrum Master, because they're indoctrinated into this idea of working. And then we do the experiment, which is my favorite one, which is just look at how many times someone is measuring and looking at your burn down. That is not like this, like just to ask them. Ask how many of like the developers, like how well do they know where they are? How well are they doing? What's their history? And every single time it turns out basically the same way. Nobody's looking. Nobody's checking. So you're basically doing what I said. You're doing a ritual that has no purpose. And then you ask the software developers, do you want to work in sprints? Do you want to do this sort of thing? These are situations where you might want to have it, because there are more ways than Scrum, for example, like doing lean processes or so forth. And so these sorts of details you can get into after a little while, but it's more important that something like a work framework is there. It's the same thing with the code. Like if there's like a million problems, these are the big things that you want, like to make sure, like as I was saying, like the CI pipeline, the automated testing, the code reviews, the tracking of stories, the preparing of work, etc., etc. These things have to be in place before you start looking at, okay, yeah, they're using anti-patterns in the code, or they could be using this tool instead of that tool, etc., etc., etc. Because usually those sorts of micro details, they don't matter as much when you have those sorts of bigger problems. But once those bigger problems are in place, or like they are fixed, then usually what I look at is I try to identify the core functionality, which usually takes a little while because you have to sort of work with people and so forth. You need to figure out where are what's the core value of this system? What does it do? That is like the primary thing that it does. And then you take a look at, because usually these sorts of systems, they always fall into some type of category of doing one thing or another, or like they are primarily doing this or primarily doing that. And then you draw upon experience and try to look at, okay, how can you structure things? It's sort of an architectural type of thing, right? So if I know that I have like a certain set of technical requirements, then I try to optimize the code for that core functionality. So instead of having, because usually when I come to a code base, it can be anything from, like, usually at the very least, it might be very scattered, like there's no like real structure to anything, where like things are like spread out all over the code base and so forth. And by just segmenting things into either logical modules, or you take, well, I try to not do a lot of refactoring where I'm just sort of moving files around. It comes down to, in my opinion, it has more to do with figuring out what should we be optimizing for. A classic, like one example I have is I had a high integration system for as an example, where they had like 16 or something integrations towards different systems. Now when you're dealing with that, that's something that needs to be maintained, where like they just had all these integrations, everything was living in like one big mess. And so I told the team, this is our main functionality right here, where all the data that we're getting, if the data access isn't structured, I mean, it doesn't matter if it's a high integration system or not, like the data is everything. It's the core of what we're doing. So the data layer of your application should be in a very good state. And in this case, it's an integration situation where we don't have our own database. We're connected to upstream systems, which means that we also need to document that, because these integrations mean absolutely nothing to someone who's like myself, who just like sort of came in here. It's just a bunch of URLs. I don't even know where to find them. So the first thing we did was to segment those things into their own modules. We added like documentation to each integration with contact information to the teams who own the APIs and so forth, and made that like a really nice thing. We didn't fix all the other stuff that we had. We had tons of issues, but this was the thing we focused on, because this is 90% of the code that was being touched whenever a new feature came into existence. So you try to coach people towards the high value things, the things that are going to really matter, and going into like these tinier libraries, like, or you're using that library versus that library and so forth, that's not so important. You go in precedency of impact, if that makes sense. You start with the big stuff that you can affect, and then you work your way down, because after that the next thing was looking at, okay, you have all of these, in this case it was a React application on the front end, you have all these React components, they are completely untested. We need to take a look at that. So like, we are now running tests, we have a CI pipeline and so forth, but we don't have any coverage. So we added a coverage checker, and then we started committing ourselves to making more and more tests and so forth and so forth. And after that was fixed, the next thing comes along. Okay, we have all of these issues with like regressions and so forth and so forth. All right, now we should probably add either visual regression tests or BTD or something like that. And you kind of just go down the list, like where you make suggestions and motivate what's the impact of this thing that I'm suggesting to you, and what is the current problem, like what is the impact of not doing this thing. And soon, like after a little while, you sort of get to a point where, okay, this thing it's not perfect. There's like tons of like little ugly things or things that could be nicer and so forth, but the frame of the whole thing is there. It's gonna work as well as it can work. And when you get like within reason, and when you've gotten to that point, My coaching and like the way I try to suggest things has less to do with, all right, you should be doing this, you should be doing that. I'm not like necessarily creating stories. In that scenario, it's more about talking to the team. Okay, what do you want? What should happen next? How would you like to fix these sorts of issues? Like, do you have any other problems that you would like me to fix? You sort of take more of a requesting role. What is not so good? What can we improve on together? Because now we're getting into like the micro details of the whole thing. And in that scenario, it's sort of like you could, and I've said that to many managers as well, who like continuously ask me, how can we improve? How can we do better? How can we do the next thing? And I kind of go, yeah, in one team this might work, in another team it's not going to work, because the unfortunate truth is that the people who are looking for perfection are sometimes not in the same team, or the people who are really good and can really push it and like bring the absolute highest levels of innovations. Like this is not that team. These are people who don't give a shit, or these are people who are like mostly junior level developers and they're not ready to do like really advanced stuff. And it doesn't make sense for me to suggest them to go into these super advanced concepts when the return on investment is like not really significant. And so you have to like do on a case by case basis and pull some experience out of it into it. So what I want you to take away from this is that examples of me's coaching is really down to, first, are you sort of, if it's a software engineer you're coaching, it's usually down to getting to know the person, seeing them work, looking at code reviews, talking to them, just basically working next side by side with them for a little while until you get to know them well enough to know like what they're good at, what they're not so good at. And if you have ideas, you have an open conversation about it. You never do unsolicited things usually. It's more about having, if they are looking for that coaching, and it's usually in this case as a junior, it's not that often that senior. I have coached seniors as well, but it's not as often. But it really comes down to that. Knowing what's going to help the person take the next step, and what is a good story. Like for juniors, it's actually very easy. Often it's down to they're trying to learn the domain, and you should know what stories will let them touch important parts of the code that it's going to teach them how the domain of the system works. That's a very good approach as a general guideline. Give them the right stories to work on. For seniors it's more difficult, but it's the same process basically. You find them projects or find them things to work on that's going to bring benefit to the company primarily, and if that's not possible, suggest to them like technologies or courses or information that they can look at in their own time or some other time that might be allocated. For teams, it's like always go in precedency of importance. Always make sure that the basics are there. If the CI pipeline isn't working, or they're not doing code reviews, or like they don't have any automated testing, or any like these basics of the basics, if any of that is not working flawlessly, don't waste your time on anything else. Like focus on that first and foremost, because nothing is going to be more efficient than having a well-functioning team at the macro level. The macro level has to work first and foremost, and it's very unlikely that you're going to have a better idea than these sort of proven practices that the vast majority of the industry is using. If you do, more power to you, but odds are that you're going to be better off to just sort of copy-paste the basics, and then you can tweak things if you're like, as I was saying, like if you have like really specific cases. Because I mean, I tell people all the time, I'm not against Scrum, but if you're applying it, or like some other practices, the same thing I have with technology, if you don't know when this thing makes sense, you're going to use it incorrectly and just slow yourself down or cause harm or so forth to like the overall productivity. And then once you've done that, once those things are in place, you take a look at what is the most touched code, what is the most important parts to get right within this system, and then you try to shuffle everything around so that you have, it's almost a hierarchy of importance, where the most important functionality and features is this where you put your effort. The stuff that is changing almost all the time is the stuff that you want to make sure that it's well tested, that it's well taken care of, it's well like segmented logically and so forth, so that, because that's the big concept in the system, and the big concept is more important to make sure that that's clean and feels efficient than it is to fix like every little detail that you basically never touch. So like order things in terms of how much are you using this piece of logic, or how important is this piece of logic to your overall system, and then just go down the list until you reach a point where, as I said, it's like micro improvements you're doing now, where you could basically just say that, yeah, we can just focus on whatever anybody wants to improve, because now like all the really big stuff has been improved. Have a great day.